The grand illusion of superpower longevity is rarely shattered by a sudden, deafening collapse. It does not announce itself with the dramatic fall of a capital city or the signing of a surrender treaty on the deck of a battleship. Instead, the architecture of empire crumbles quietly, in the dark, through a series of invisible, desperate liquidations. We are conditioned by a relentless media apparatus to perceive global supremacy through the lens of aircraft carrier deployments, highly publicized diplomatic summits, and the sheer, unquestionable gravity of the reserve currency. But underneath this theater of strength, a terrifying and systemic hemorrhage is unfolding in real time. What you are about to understand is not a geopolitical strategy of dominance. It is a palliative care operation for a hegemon rapidly consuming its own flesh to maintain the illusion of a heartbeat. Just days ago, a seismic shift occurred in the global flow of vital resources, a shift completely masked by the deafening noise of the Middle Eastern conflict. To grasp the sheer magnitude of this structural decay, we must first tear away the facade of American energy independence. The narrative sold to the public is one of infinite shale abundance and unassailable domestic production. The reality, dictated by the unforgiving math of global supply chains, tells a profoundly different story. In the 6 months preceding the recent explosion of kinetic violence involving Iran, the United States was quietly operating as a massive net importer of crude. The calculus was brutal but clear. The nation was absorbing 6.6 million barrels of oil per day to keep its vast, energy-hungry logistics network breathing, while exporting a mere 4 million barrels. A massive deficit. A structural vulnerability. Then the conflict ignited. And almost overnight, defying the physical limits of domestic extraction, the United States miraculously transitioned into a net exporter. How does a nation running a massive energy deficit suddenly flood the global market with crude in the midst of a geopolitical crisis? It does not drill faster. It does not magically conjure new reserves from the Permian Basin. It opens the emergency valves. It cannibalizes its absolute last line of defense. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The political class parades the SPR as a bottomless subterranean ocean of salvation. They will cite the theoretical capacity of 374 million barrels, comfortably resting in 4 sprawling networks of hollowed-out salt caverns stretching across the subterranean architecture of Texas and Louisiana, filled with a mix of medium sour and light sweet crude. The numbers sound invincible on a press release. But geopolitics does not run on theoretical maximums. It runs on the cold, unforgiving physics of extraction. They're not steel tanks sitting on a concrete floor. These are geological formations. To extract the oil, operators must pump millions of gallons of fresh water into the caverns. The water displaces the crude, forcing it to the surface. But water dissolves salt. With every emergency drawdown, the structural integrity of these subterranean vaults is violently eroded. You cannot scrape the bottom of a dissolving cavern without risking a catastrophic collapse of the entire geological structure. The engineering reality. The hard, terrifying truth that is never broadcast on evening news networks is that the effective, usable volume of that strategic reserve is roughly half of the stated capacity. When you strip away the ghost oil that can never be safely extracted, the math becomes apocalyptic. At the current, aggressive rate of depletion being used to artificially suppress global price spikes, the United States possesses merely 50 to 60 days of genuine, usable reserve capacity. A 2-month buffer standing between a functioning hyper-economy and total logistical paralysis. Consider what this means on the ground. Picture a freezing dawn at a massive logistics hub outside of Chicago. A long-haul freight driver, breath pluming in the cold air, tops off the dual tanks of a diesel rig. He watches the numbers on the pump roll, noticing the price per gallon has unexpectedly held steady, perhaps even dropped by a few cents. He breathes a momentary sigh of relief, thinking the worst of the inflationary storm has passed. He climbs back into the cab, turns the ignition, and pulls onto the interstate, completely oblivious to the fact that the fuel combusting in his engine is heavily subsidized by the liquidation of his nation's ultimate survival insurance. He is standing at the epicenter of a dying industrial paradigm, entirely unaware that the 10-cent discount keeping him solvent this week was purchased by hollowing out the strategic foundation of the next decade. But the tragedy of this asset-stripping operation goes far beyond domestic appeasement. In the past 72 hours, the data reveals an arbitrage so strategically devastating it borders on the surreal. 7 million barrels of irreplaceable crude, siphoned from those very dissolving salt caverns, were loaded onto very large crude carriers. And where did the lifeblood of American strategic resilience sail? It sailed directly to Asia, to India, to Pakistan, and to the People's Republic of China. Here at Global Truth Pulse, we do not simply read the headlines. We track the subterranean tectonic shifts that rewrite the future. And the shift here is chilling. The United States is actively bleeding its finite emergency physical assets to suppress a temporary market panic, while its greatest geopolitical adversary methodically hoards every discounted drop it can secure. China is actively filling its massive, expanding storage terminals, capitalizing on the fire sale of American leverage. We are draining our blood to artificially stabilize the global dollar framework, and Beijing is quietly standing by with a bucket, collecting the runoff to fuel its own rise. This is not a defense strategy. This is a calculated resource harvesting operation. It is an organized transfer of long-term geopolitical leverage from the United States to its most patient competitors. Yet, the hemorrhage is not merely liquid. It is kinetic. The same fatal logic driving the liquidation of energy assets is actively disintegrating the absolute bleeding edge of the American military shield. Shift your gaze from the Gulf Coast to the violent skies over the Middle East. Beneath the rhetoric of ironclad alliances and unwavering defense of Israel against Iranian proxies, a catastrophic mathematical reality is unfolding in the upper atmosphere. The weapon of choice in this theater of interception is the THAAD system, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It is a masterpiece of kinetic kill technology, designed to vaporize ballistic threats outside the Earth's atmosphere. It is also an exquisite, painstakingly slow-to-manufacture asset. Every single time a THAAD interceptor clears a launch tube, $13 million is instantly turned to ash and debris in the sky. $13 million of highly specialized solid rocket motors, advanced seekers, and rare earth components, fired to neutralize retrofitted, mass-produced ballistic threats that cost a fraction of a percent of the interceptor's value. In the brief, turbulent weeks since this current escalation matrix began, the United States has expended approximately half of its entire global stockpile of THAAD interceptors. So let that sink into your analytical framework. Half. Decades of procurement, billions in defense appropriations, and the intricate, fragile supply chains required to build these hyper-advanced systems, evaporated in a matter of weeks to swat away swarms in a regional proxy war. Translated into raw survival terms, the planetary shield is suddenly catastrophically porous. The interceptors are gone, and you cannot 3D print a replacement overnight. The solid rocket motor supply chain is completely bottlenecked. The rare earth metals require complex, multi-year processing pipelines, heavily dependent on the very Asian markets currently absorbing America's liquidated oil. What happens when the Pacific Theater ignites? What happens when a genuine peer-to-peer saturation strike threatens the carrier strike groups in the South China Sea? And the magazines are empty because the interceptors were burned over the deserts of the Levant. The short-term political operatives in Washington and allied capitals emerge as the undisputed beneficiaries of this grand illusion. Allied governments secure, discounted, subsidized access to American strategic crude, while leveraging irreplaceable U.S. military assets to shield their own domestic infrastructure, completely insulating themselves from the actual cost of their regional postures. Meanwhile, the military-industrial complex, the prime contractors sitting in glass-walled boardrooms in Northern Virginia, stand to reap astronomical profits. They are already salivating at the backlog, securing massive, multi-year, non-competitive contracts to slowly replenish the THAAD stockpiles that were just vaporized. But who bears the genuine cost? It falls squarely, crushingly, on the American populace and the future strategic posture of the Republic. Step away from the Pentagon briefing rooms and look at a forgotten, snow-dusted, working-class neighborhood in the American Rust Belt. A family sits at a kitchen table, illuminated by a single, harsh bulb, staring at a winter heating and utility bill that has mathematically outpaced their combined stagnant wages. They are forced to make the brutal, degrading calculation between purchasing vital medications, keeping the thermostat above freezing, or putting adequate protein on the table. They are completely alienated from the macro-geopolitical chessboard, entirely unaware that the national wealth and resources that could have stabilized their grid, rebuilt their industrial base, and secured their children's economic future have been aggressively liquidated. Their future was detonated at Mach 8 in the Middle Eastern sky, and their physical energy security was pumped into the belly of a supertanker bound for Shenzhen. This is the grim reality of late-stage financialized empire. Beneath the soaring, moralistic rhetoric of supporting democratic allies and countering Iranian aggression, we are witnessing a desperate financial maneuver. It is an operation aimed at manipulating global oil flows to maintain the illusion of short-term monetary stability. The entire framework of dollar hegemony relies on the perception of infinite stability and infinite reach. But when the fiscal printing presses reach their absolute mathematical limit, when you realize that you can print trillions of fiat currency, but you absolutely cannot print a barrel of medium sour crude, nor can you print a titanium aerospace component, the system begins to eat itself. The United States is liquidating its irreplaceable physical assets to paper over an energy and defense crisis that traditional macroeconomic tools can no longer hide. Let us engage in a final, cold sand table projection. China's backing of Iran is not merely an ideological alignment. It is a masterclass in asymmetrical exhaustion. Beijing understands that the most efficient way to dismantle a superior adversary is not a frontal assault, but a war of attrition on multiple secondary fronts. By emboldening Iranian proxies, China effectively forces the United States into a massive, unrecoverable expenditure of its most critical strategic reserves. America drains its salt caverns to keep the oil markets from shattering the Western financial system. America depletes its multi-billion-dollar interceptor stockpiles to protect regional allies. And while the United States bleeds physical commodities to maintain the status quo of yesterday, China hoards energy, accelerates its own defense procurement, and secures the raw materials of tomorrow. The strategic leverage is not just shifting. It is being actively redistributed to those who have the patience to watch the hegemon suffocate on its own obligations. Here at Global Truth Pulse, we demand that you look past the theatrical press briefings and observe the structural decay. The transition from physical dominance to financial illusion is nearly complete. The safety nets have been cut, the vaults are being emptied, and the shields are burning out in the atmosphere. So I leave you with a question. One that requires you to strip away your political conditioning and look at the brutal mathematics of survival. Are we currently witnessing the calculated, necessary preservation of the global security order? Or are we watching the greatest, most reckless fire sale of strategic assets in the history of a collapsing empire? Drop your geopolitical analysis in the comments below. The algorithm rewards compliance, but the future belongs to those who understand the cold reality of the chessboard. Subscribe if you demand the unvarnished truth, and prepare for what comes when the caverns finally run dry.